Right. I think since we only have 1 hour, we better get started. A warm welcome to you all. Thank you for coming and joining us for this event. We are very happy and proud to be able to welcome participants from every continent on this planet except Australia. But we literally have people who registered from Africa, from Asia, from Latin America, from North America, from 10 EU member states and 2 other European countries. So it's really a very international gathering, and we're very, very happy about that. A very special welcome to our panelists who are Sarah Davidson, CEO of the Carnegie UK Trust, whom we've been working with on this project for, well, since the beginning really, and Annegret Reisner from the Swiss Mercator Foundation. She is the chair of the board there, and we've known each other for a good long while too. To introduce the head of the project, that is Rolf Alter, former director at OECD and very happily now with the Mecenate Foundation directing this project. And you will also see Timo Unger, who is the student assistant with this project, has been helping us all along since we started it now about 2 years ago. Let me just make a couple of household remarks. Number one, as usual, to inform you that this session is being recorded. The second is that you are invited to comment and ask questions in the chat function. Please use the chat function. And to add to that, I would kindly ask you, much as you might want to do this, to not use the chat function just to say hello everybody, because that fills the chat function and then has to go through 25 or 30 hellos before one gets to an actual question. And finally, since we really have people from all over the world and the connection might not be 100% good, I would ask you to be mute and without a picture of yourself while you're not actually speaking. So with that, welcome again, and I hand over straight away to Rolf to introduce the subject of our discussion today.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rupert, and thank you very much for everybody joining us. We're delighted to have you with us, and we hope that we have a nice exchange. So I will be very short and brief on what it is that perhaps beyond our briefing note and the invitation we would like to talk about. The first is simply to share with you what at least we see in the philanthropic world these days. I think it is really quite a trend to see the interest in trust as a critical, if not an indispensable resource for philanthropic institutions to be successful. Let's put it just what it is. Let's make sure that this is at least an observation that we had already when we started, as Rupert was saying 2 years ago. But I do think that the current development of the pandemic, like in many, many other institutions, has really led to an even greater awareness about the relevance of trust. So it's no specifically philanthropic institutional perception. I think it is true for all the institutions that are today trying to make either policy like government, but also those in the civil society and private sector. Second, when we assume that trust is such an important resource, we were really very interested to see what it is that philanthropic institutions, foundations do to get closer to a trust-driven philanthropy. When we started, and created Philanthropy Insight, we actually tried to make sure we catch what at least our understanding about the real important building blocks of trust would be. And as you could see here on the screen, we look at commitment, public purpose, relevance, performance, and accountability. Of course, these are very big themes, and we have, for those of you who have perhaps had the time to look at some of our literature produced, we have developed that into a neat set of questions. But as I also think we will come back to that for another reason, and that is simply to say, we discovered that it wasn't just those building blocks. We also wanted to learn about the dimensions of trust. And I will underline, it's three, let me put it positively. There are three dimensions that we think are relevant. It's the trust within the institutions. It is the trust between philanthropic institutions and civil society, but also with those that are government, private sector, if you like, the other actors in our current social in the sense of societal affairs. So three dimensions of trust are what we think makes the discussion even more pertinent. But we also saw that when we listened and we exchanged with a lot of experts, we saw that there was a demand for some very practical issues. Who would launch these strategic reflections about going towards a trust-driven strategy for foundations? Who and how will that process be organized? We also said, are there practices already today that would be shared and would be worthwhile to discuss and exchange so that we can see how to do it in practice? And last but not least, if you engage in this strategy, would there be measures of success? And what could that be? What measures could that be? Today, though, I think what we really also would like to discuss with you is how do we progress? How do we really make progress on that recognition that we have to act on making trust such a critical ingredient of current philanthropic activities? And for that, we thought it would be a useful approach to speak of a joint learning process. A joint learning process in which all those who are interested in that direction would engage themselves in a self-assessment of what it is that they already have and where would they like to go, and do that in a group of people, of like-minded people, as we said in the briefing note, who would, in great confidence with each other, discuss and exchange, and hopefully really agree on some of the things that need to be done and would make sense for foundations in particular. We're aware, and Rupert was just making the point, that we have a very broad audience with different ideas about, perhaps different ideas about what it is that makes good on trust in philanthropy. That would be just fantastic if we can understand the differences, can understand the different approaches that have been taken to be in the end able to, let me say it, to share an understanding of what it is that we're looking for and how we get there. It's a process. It's an open, it's a confidential process of making these exchanges happen. And if that were a not too ambitious objective, then I think it would be great if we could get onto it by doing exactly that, learning together. That's some of our questions, some of our ideas for today. And I do look forward to comments, questions, and a rich exchange. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rolf, for this very concise introduction. And I hope you've got the gist of what we're trying to achieve today, what we really want to discuss. And we will start discussing it with our two panelists. Thank you for agreeing to do this with us. And my first question goes to Annegret Reisner. You've been involved in philanthropy and foundation matters for a good long time, but you haven't been involved with this particular project till very recently. So how does this strike you? Is this something that you would find helpful? Is this something that you would find rather nonsensical, or something in between? Just tell us.
Thank you very much for inviting me and sharing this project with me. It was very interesting to read what you have already done, and I really agree with your starting point, saying that trust is something really important these days, and I think it will be even more. We are actually finishing a whole strategic reflection that we have been working on for more than a year, and actually I find a lot of the criterions that you have in your 5 in the graphic. I find it in what we have been discussing and what we have been thinking of, and so it actually, well, I could hook into your discussion, and I think it's really interesting. What we have seen a lot, that we want to move to even more cooperation. We have had this even before, but it's not just seeing that the problems are so complex, and that the scarcity of the funding that convince us to move towards cooperation, but it's also the fact that we feel we need expertise from all of the group of people that work in the same direction. So, and we can't understand everything. We need to share also knowledge, and that's also a reason that I see why it's important to talk about trust, because if you want to share these insights, you need trust. Just as you all just said, if you want to do a self-assessment in a group of people, you need to expose, and you need trust to do that. So yeah, I think I really, I'm very interested to discuss with you and share with you some insights.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Sharing knowledge, cooperating more than in the past. That seems to have come out of what you were saying. So I turn to Sarah, who is not only the CEO of the Carnegie UK Trust, but of course, as part of a much larger Carnegie family. She's has quite an overview over what goes on in philanthropy worldwide. Sarah, your comments. What would you see as the sort of the most important thing in this project?
Well, thank you, Rupert, and thank you for the invitation to join the discussion this afternoon. When I was thinking about this, I was recognizing I have two perspectives. One as the CEO of a trust itself, which, similar to our previous speaker, is undergoing a period of strategic assessment at the moment. but also as a member of a peer group of foundations within the United Kingdom who all share a broad but differentiated interest in issues related to social justice. And in these conversations, particularly of the COVID period, I think there has been a growing awareness of many of the issues which Rolf spoke about earlier, and a growing anxiety that there should be a place for philanthropic organisations in the discussion about how to build back better, as the Anglophone countries seem to be calling it. But in doing so, to connect the building back better discussion with a pre-existing response to 4 issues in particular, the issue of climate, the issue of racial justice, the issues of social and economic inequalities, and the questions of threats to democracy. And something that connects all of those challenges are some very pointed questions about power, who has power, who wields power, who benefits from power. And that, of course, immediately, I think, takes you to some really important discussion of relationships and of trust. And for me, I have seen the response to the crisis, and particularly for those foundations which fund directly, really accelerate questions about the gap between existing funding models and how to meet immediate need well. And very often, trust has been at the heart of that, and a sense of a need to step much more confidently into a place of trusting beneficiaries to make good choices and good judgments about how funding is used. And where those foundations already had a model of participatory grant making, I think that shift has been accelerated, but for others it has had to be much more on the hoof and much more ad hoc. And I just want to say something briefly as well about this point about climate justice and racial justice, because I have seen, even in my very short time in the foundation sector, a shift where concern for climate justice and racial justice are no longer simply the preserve of those foundations who have that as an explicit mission, but increasingly at the heart of legitimacy and reputation for many, many, if not all, organisations in the sector. And that, alongside the increasing concern about the challenge to democracy posed by populism and disinformation, I think again introduces questions about whose interests really inform decision making and who to believe. And while I think that much of this is to be welcomed, I also perceive a number of risks. First, that there is not always a cohering logic to initiatives and interventions, and that foundations pick these off singly as they arise, absent an overall understanding of strategic intent. Secondly, that foundations might conclude too quickly that the right response to discussions of power and trust and equity is to step right back. And while I understand where this can come from, a desire to be humble and not to abuse privilege, I think it's also an abdication of responsibility that shouldn't be undertaken lightly. And then thirdly, I think there's a risk that people are too focused inwards and not outwards, and that therefore, even if asking themselves the good questions, they miss the opportunity to learn from others that my colleague mentioned a moment ago, while we're all trying to make sense of these complex challenges. And I think it's those 3 risks or those 3 issues that make me see real potential in the Philanthropy Insights tool, because it can both offer a structure to work within foundations, but critically can also be a vehicle for cross-organizational insights and cross-organizational learning. And that's why I'm very interested as well this afternoon to hear from other colleagues on this call to see if other people both see that possibility, but would also be interested in the collaboration to bring it to life. Thank you, Rupert.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. You've brought up quite a range of very interesting and very important points. And I'll just pick one to shoot it back at Rolf and at all of you, really. You were saying that there are some core goals like social justice that each and every foundation must take on board, regardless of of its actual sort of statutory purpose, because they're so important to underpin the legitimacy of philanthropic action that nobody could sort of really afford to leave those out. Now, this, of course, is probably contrary to what traditional philanthropy experts have always said. They've always said you must stick exactly to what is in your deed or in your bylaws, and that is that. And most foundations still operate that way. So, Rolf, what's your take on that one? Do you think all foundations must sort of take on a few core values and fight for them?
Thank you very much. And thank you very much, Sarah and Annegret, for your contributions. Must they all take on the same values? Well, I think they all share already one value, and that's the value of giving. But that's not enough, as we know, for building trust. We've seen that in the past. So I do think that it is not so much, at least the way that I see it, about really what exactly is being done. But when you look at our building blocks, there are a few references to how things would need to be done that you would like to pursue. And I refer in particular to the issue of relevance. But before you go to relevance, you will look at commitment and public purpose. And I do think that when you read the list of public purpose today that exists, at least in a broad agreement of society, there are some things that actually come to mind immediately. Is it the first, the second, or the third priority that you would need to pursue, or that you would prefer to really engage with? I do think that we leave that to the individual foundations. But to look at what it is that your contribution does to public purpose and why you do it, what's your commitment to do it, looking at the relevance, I think you will automatically nearly go through a set of questions that you will have to answer. And remember, please, what have we developed in our tool? Questions. We have not answered every individual question. We're raising issues for self-assessment, meaning results may not necessarily be identical, but they will have been the result of reflection about those building blocks that we're looking at. So that's where I see the contribution raising a somewhat limited but very serious question of what is it that when you look at the strategy of a foundation, if you are the chief executive officer or you are the philanthropist, the founder, what is it that are your answers would tell you about where to go for being, in the end, a trusted, but also a trust-driven philanthropy?
Thank you. You mentioned an important aspect of this whole project. I mean, we did develop a sort of big idea of what philanthropy should look like, and we've talked about that. But the result was to develop a real tool, an assessment tool, in order to be able to sort of pin foundations down to that and make them look at their own foundation and see whether they can live up to these expectations. And I think that's quite an important aspect of this exercise, that there is a big idea behind it, but it is also a very practical and very sort of hands-on kind of a tool. I'm looking at Annegret and Sarah, if you'd like to come in at this point. If not, I would invite everybody to come in via the chat function and make any comments or ask any questions you'd like to do. Annegret.
Well, I found it very interesting that which categories you group around this topic of trust. And for me, a very question was, where is the individual? Because if I think about trust in our work and working and cooperating with other organizations, I would always look at the dimension that you present, but I would also say I have to look at the people that work there to see if the whole setting is trustworthy and if you want to cooperate. So that was a really big issue I found when I saw your tool. And I also, when I started to think about how or what things can I draw from this for my practical work, I thought, well, somehow these dimensions are connected and interdependent. So it would be interesting to see these interdependencies to also get an idea where to start and how to work with that. That was two insights that I had when reading, and maybe we can later on talk about this and also some concrete experiences we have had, how to work with that.
Thank
We
you.
have 2 comments in the chat, Rupert.
Yes, I've seen them.
Great, okay.
I've seen the comments, and the first one who would like to come in is Rien van Gent, if I may say so, a real old foundation hand. He's been into the philanthropic world for a long time, lots of experience. Rien, please.
Thank you very much, Rupert, and very nice to be part of this conversation. My starting point would be that you see distrust in society, not only directed to foundations. You see that vis-a-vis politics, vis-a-vis government, vis-a-vis media, and also vis-a-vis foundations. So it is important to realize that it is not exclusively directed to us. And I think it is a question about our own legitimacy. We have to take that seriously. And what I like about your approach, that if you want to address that, for instance, what Annegret was saying, through a better cooperation and sharing of knowledge, you only solve part of the problem because you have first to look at the microcosmos. You have first of all to look at the inner circle of foundations themselves, and then the way foundations deal with their grantees, with their communities, and then you can broaden it to see how to counter those arguments that are coming from the people like Robert Reich or Brechtman at the World Economic Forum, etc., etc. And I think therefore that we ought to look at ourselves. I see also distrust inside foundations, and that is very fundamental. I see that in family foundations, for instance, where you have a founder and 3 children, 3 different families, and they are not in agreement, despite the fact that they have one foundation. I see it distrust between generations. I see distrust between the staff of a foundation and a founder, very often related to do we walk the talk? Are we taking things seriously? Are we genuine? So I would like to start with the inner circle, then to look at the way we relate to communities. Fortunately, in my opinion, due to COVID, I see that many foundations are putting more trust in their recipients. Maybe they were forced by it, and the question is whether this can be sustained. But all of a sudden, foundations are being seen as more agile, for instance, giving more flexibility, doing away with bureaucratic crap, even swapping project funding for institutional funding. If that's being observed by an outside world, that would even contribute, in my opinion, to creating trust back from where we were. Your point, finally, with respect to, is there an overarching objective? And I like that approach by Sarah, by the way. And I think there is, and maybe it is social justice, but for me, it is also issues that are generic to what we do, and that is sustainability. It is the future of the planet. It doesn't make sense, in my opinion, for any foundation. I was heading the Van Leer Foundation, early childhood education, and I always said, if we are just focusing on this, we are moving the deck chairs on the Titanic. We ought to look at the fact that we want our children to grow up in a safe environment. So what we have all in common is that if we are there in perpetuity, yes, there is an overriding objective, and that is a sustainable environment.
Thank you, Rien. I was reminded of two things while you were talking. One is my very first lecture in philosophy that I listened to as a young student many years ago, and the professor said, if you don't trust the others to say the truth in a discussion, you don't even have to start discussing it at all. And I've always remembered that you have to trust people, otherwise you can't really interact properly. And the other thing I was reminded of when you mentioned the Titanic was a sign I saw in the shop window just before the first lockdown, and it said, always remember, the Noah's Ark was built by amateurs and the Titanic was built by professionals. I think a lot of sort of spirit comes into all this. The second person who's already asked to speak is Carola Carazzone from ASIFERO, the Italian Association of Foundations. Carola, please.
Yeah, I have two brief comments. One for Italy, and the other one is for Europe. I've been working for several European organizations support organizations like Daphne and Ariadne and ECFI. About Italy, we realize how relevant and how really important is this project. It's a country where we, around 3 years ago, really identify lack of trust as the main constraint to have a capable, bold, strong, and resilient civil society. So very much on the second dimension of trust that before Rolf was highlighting. And so we started a call to action to all Italian foundations in order to change the funding practice based on a trust dimension, which is of course only part of what you do, but I think it was a very interesting journey, really to try to make the case in a variety of ways. And for us, this variety of argument, in order to demonstrate that is not just important because it's just, but is important because in order to be successful, in order to be effective, and to prove in some way that without trust, so with just a restricted project and list of activities and all these kind of controlling mechanisms in the funding practice that are there and very dominant in philanthropy, like, in context of philanthropy like the Italian one. I mean, in the end, there is no not the impact that could be and not the effectiveness that could be. This is the lesson that we learned, and I think it's very similar to what we are also trying to deploy at European level in the PACS community, for example, as a community of practice of all the practitioner doing my job, so supporting philanthropy, and there the discourse is really trying to engage beyond the funders that are already aligned on participatory grant making or on these more trust-driven mechanisms, and really to find arguments that can demonstrate that trust is needed in order to be effective and in order to be impactful. Thank you.
Thank you, Carola. I can just read a comment from Florian Covelli from France. He says, perhaps trust could also open the discussion on public purpose governance, i.e. how to decide together with people aimed by our actions. Foundation and civil society organizations want to transform society, and that needs a lot of strong convictions about what is good for society. But we hear more and more questions about the democratic legitimacy of our actions. Why are we legitimate to decide what is good for people? I think that it could lead us to better and wider associate people, to our decisions. Yes, that's a very valid comment. And then we have Mark Carrigan, who starts, could I ask Rolf or perhaps Annegret and Sarah? So please just go ahead and ask them. Mark, would you like to come in? You must switch your microphone on. No?
And how about now?
Yeah, now it's okay.
Very good. Sorry, a few minor technical issues. I think you saw me a bit in Smurf mode there at the very beginning. For the panel, it's really to understand in exactly the topics you've been talking about, what role our understanding and awareness of how others are viewing us and the lens with which their beliefs, their preconceived, rightly or wrongly, ideas are shaping their trust in us, and how we need to acknowledge that and maybe meet that halfway in building that trust.
Thank you. Annegret and Sarah, would you like to come in on this point? Annegret?
Well, if I understand you right, you're asking how we could deal with mistrust that is around us and sort of how to start to build trust, because as I see it, you actually need a certain level of trust in your context to actually start building on it. If you fear that some information that you're giving in a dialogue will be harmful for you afterwards, you will never start this trustful dialogue. So somehow you depend on also some circumstances. But if you assume there is sort of a confidential context, I guess it's really something that has been mentioned also before. It's this walk the talk. It depends also from what you are living and how you cope with certain aspects. If there's a coherence between what you do and what you sort of expect from others. And if, for an example, if we as a foundation talk about things that we didn't achieve, where we have had mistakes or failures, this might increase the confidence of our partner organizations to also share their problems, because we are a grant making foundation. So actually we give the funding to others to do to work with that money, and of course there always is a certain imbalance of power, but if we live a constructive manner of dealing with mistakes, it will be much easier for others to also share their problems with us. And I think this really increases trust, and you can start growing this this trust in the cooperation.
I think that's a very crucial point, to admit mistakes and admit to failures, rather than always sort of pretending one's done everything well, everything has been fine, everything's been a success, and so on. Yeah, very, very good point. Sarah, would you like to come in?
Yes, thank you, Rupert. And if I may, I'd like to build on that by reference back to the comment from Florian, which you read out a moment ago, because I do think that this is a very important question. How do foundations really listen to the people for whom they exist? There is a phrase, and again, I do not know how well, if it has equivalent in the non-Anglophonic world, but it is used a lot, particularly by organizations trying to combat poverty. And the phrase is, nothing about us without us is for us. And that has guided a lot of thinking about how to properly really not just listen to, but hear the experience and the perspective of the beneficiaries of philanthropy. And I think my observation would be, and it comes back perhaps in part to my earlier comment about strategic coherence. I think that before stepping into that space, in order to develop rather than destroy trust, a foundation must think very carefully about what it is truly doing, and to understand how it stays with that commitment. Because I think it is quite easy to talk about doing these things, and it's probably relatively easy to set them up, but you have to deeply understand what that journey of building trust might entail. And I think that both staff members and trustees of organizations must be prepared to stay with it and see where it leads. And that is, of course, and you've already mentioned some of the dimensions of trust before, and I do think that willingness to go on the journey and to be prepared to adapt and evolve around what you learn is really, really critical, but we shouldn't pretend that's easy. And maybe that comes, again, I think that's point about being prepared to admit when you've got something wrong is really important, because in that new territory, almost by definition, we will get some things wrong.
Thank you. I have, I think it's Ruth Williams, who's put in a remark. Would you like to just repeat it to everybody? Ruth?
If you guys hear me, I'm on my phone.
Yes, we can hear you.
Perfect, perfect. I think that one of the main problems also is that our society is not used to admit to failures, and that's especially crucial when it comes to partnerships between foundations and the beneficiaries, because both sides are probably not used to admit to failures, and that brings a huge disbalance in a relationship. And I think it should be maybe put out from the very beginning that it's okay if you don't reach your goals as long as you talk about it, or that there's a certain level of flexibility that can be given to projects and corporations.
Thank you. Thank you. Rolf, it's high time you came in. What do you make of all these comments?
Rupert, I'm delighted to hear them. No doubt about it. If you let me just I'll come back to 2 or 3 things that I thought were very sort of immediately provoking some reaction. I just want to say, Reen, thank you reminding us, and I do think that your comment on the internal trust relations seem to me at least very often overlooked. I have to say, I think we found out a bit more about it when Timo in particular was having quite a few, I have to say, interviews with people who would just sort of check their own environment in foundations. So I do think that looking at, is they're really walking the talk, or is it just the communication that's presented as reflecting what happens in foundations? So I do think a critical issue that came back actually through a different door when we discovered, I have to, at least let me just be clear, I discovered that there was a question of who actually would launch some sort of self-assessment in a foundation. I would have thought that's something that happens frequently, but it didn't quite seem to be the case. So yeah, internal relationships, very important. And they are a cornerstone of probably being perceived also outside the organization as being trusted. A second point, Carola, if I just may say something about your sentence, and I thought a very interesting conclusion. You said it, funding practices may be just one element, but certainly when you do it well and when you generate the trust, you have an impact on, you said that you have an impact, a larger impact than you would have otherwise, and you would improve effectiveness. And I do think those are 2 points that I would really hope that we can in the next while, when we sit together among our like-minded partners, when we could make that not just a statement, but perhaps have some very good examples, practices that include this kind of I wouldn't just say feedback, but where we can see we are getting better to what we actually intended to do by having a very trusted relationship. And that's what Mark, and I say, Mark, you said it's the way that people from the outside look at foundations. I do think, you know, I will here, as you have heard from Rupert, I'm not in the area of philanthropy all my life. It is something that I learned really when I was in the OECD working with many, many countries around those actors that could improve what Sarah was referring to. I think we had these discussions, perhaps not in that sharp way that you formulated it, Sarah, but we did have it, economic inequalities, but also access to services and so on and so on. And I do think that the way that the beneficiaries, but also others that hear about what foundations do, that forms certainly the basis for this two-way relationship. After all, trust has to be extended, but also trust has to be earned. And this relationship means that there is something about accountability. You would want to, even if you're not obliged, if there's no rule, but we're not talking about rules here. We're talking about self-established principles or ideas. How would it look like? Not that someone says, no, but you have to make a report every year. This is not the kind of accountability that we had in mind. So when you have that bilateral relationship between those that are acting, extending trust to beneficiaries, for example, they will also have the return on it. And this will not just the beneficiaries, it will be others. But you will have to make that behavior, this attitude, and I'd say those practices actually known. And my last point, Sarah, you know, listen to, but also hear. You said hear most of all. That was a long debate when we were starting to put these 5 building blocks together. What it was that would make your commitment. It is not just what you want to do, but you would want to have that discussion and this listening to those who are in situations that you would like to do something about, help them to get out of it. But how do you do this best? Probably, but again, a very important question for comparing practices. When you understand the situation in which people are, and you see what is their priority. Sometimes it's something very, very simple, but it could be extremely effective to do it. How is that dialogue to be established? And you said before you get somewhere, you want to make sure you really understood that case. I do think, seriously, it is about our issue of relevance. It is the commitment on the one hand, because we assume, and I do think it's a very justified assumption, founders, funders, philanthropists want to help. This is not what I'm putting in any question. I don't think that anybody would want to do this. The question is just, do we help people in the specific situation with this really most appropriate ways? And I do think that we would, in our way of building these set of good practices, do a lot of good if we could compare notes about what worked in these types of dialogue. And would it be meaningful to report on them, so that others can look at it and say, interesting. These are my peers who say that. There must be something in it. Let me look at it. So by introducing good practice, not written up somewhere, it's not about experienced, right? Really what has happened. And in that confidential setting, people would probably trust that so much more than any of these very glossy, let me say it, very glossy tools that we see these days. Here is the 5 things you need to do, and then it's working. I just don't trust that. And I don't think that anybody would want to read the next 5 advisory 5 sentences. But what we would like to see is that people do this and look at it. And Ruth, Rupert, but I want to say, the failure culture, Ruth, so true, so true. Couldn't be agreed now, but it's limited. And I know that you spoke for Europe, so I do think that we have an enormous deficit in that sense, and should look elsewhere where that's not the case, where you actually said, I failed, but next time I know better. Here we're saying failed, sorry, out of the game. That to change that, let me make that suggestion. It should also be founders who are willing to admit there was a mistake, not because they are wrong, but maybe like any other risky business, sometimes you win and sometimes you don't. And if you don't, it's an invitation to do better next time. Thank you very much. A little long, I know, but still.
That was a little long, but it was fine and full of content. I did first of all, I have a comment from Rien from Ghent. I can just read it out. We often say foundations give a voice to communities. Wrong. Communities always had a voice, but we did not hear it. Yes, that's a very good comment. And
Rupert, I wonder.
Other people, just a second. Other people are making signs that they agree with this very much. Sarah, you wanted to come in.
Yes, Ruud, I'm interested to connect what Rolf said a moment ago about relevance and what you yourself said in response to my contribution earlier about the specific words of what the founding deed of a trust says, because I do think there's a very interesting discussion about the extent to which it is the implicit duty of trustees to continue to make their foundation relevant, and that in doing so they are in fact bringing to life the intention of the founder. even if that now looks quite dated, particularly in older foundations. I think in my organization, we are very fortunate in that written into our trust deed by Andrew Carnegie himself was a requirement that trustees should always make their response one that reflected the needs of the current day and not the needs of the time when the trust was established. So we are fortunate to have that, but I do wonder whether implicit for many other people might also be that as the stewards of a trust, you should be relevant for today more than captured by the very specific words on the page of yesterday. And I know some people may feel they have more or less room for maneuver there, but I think my own view is that it is a very important question that we should continue to ask, and that trustees should not be afraid to test that ground when looking for relevance today. I think it's very important for trust.
Annegret, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I think it's very true what you're saying, and it's also in the interest of the foundation to do so, to reflect on this and to reflect if you're still relevant in your times, because this gives you legitimacy. And also I think if you listen to the voices of beneficiaries, it makes it much easier to have sustainable actions and not to do something which is completely out of the blue and doesn't help anyone. So I guess it's also a self-interest of the foundations. And maybe I can add one little thing. What really struck me when I read the dimensions again today was that there's this distinction between effectiveness and impact, and which means sort of visible results, and you defined it as the impact as results that are perceived by the beneficiaries as something good for them. So there you also have this participatory view, and I really find it very important that even in the evaluation of the work of a foundation, you actually can build on this dialogue with beneficiaries, and that was a very good thing to notice.
Very good. We're sort of getting to the end of our time, but I would like to have Rolf or Timo explain what we mean by the coalition of like-minded philanthropists, because that's sort of now the next step. That's the way forward. And I call on either Rolf or Timo to tell us a little bit what you have in mind there.
I will just start for a second, because what I want to share with you as well is from my experience with the interviews that I did. One very important point that we have not talked about, but implicitly have talked about, is about the forms of trust that might exist as well, because there is trust in intentions, which is rather a form of trust that is connected to an emotional side of trust. And there is also a more practical side of trust, which is connected to trust in competence. And I think both are equally relevant. And I think that the 5 dimensions which were put at the first, which we had in mind for our overarching building blocks, so to say, they reflect on the emotional form of trust, but they also reflect on the practical form of trust. And I think that is as well quite important for the discussion. But I will leave it here, and about the next steps, maybe Rolf wants to jump in.
Thank you, Timo. Like-minded. What the idea is that or would like to go through or work with, let me put it this way, where would like to be part of a group of people who have responsibilities for foundations in strategy and in operations to go through the building blocks, test what this means for their foundation, whether it applies, whether I've done something about it, and if so, what was the approach they really used? So we said it had to be a living instrument, and it can only be fed out of this exchange of people who really have an interest or have practiced the idea of trust-driven philanthropy. And I would hope that we bring together a group of such like-minded people and start with these mutually discussing the conversation about what those building blocks have or would imply for their institutions to operate differently and get to this shared understanding. I do think that would be a very relevant, very important next step to increase the value added, going beyond the reflection and getting to something that looks like a practice that I can perhaps not copy and paste, that's not the point, but perhaps inspire. Annegret was just talking about these inspirations that you see and hear, and I'm sure that people who are in this group will be very open to really, I hope, very open, not just about the success stories, but those things that have turned out to be less effective, less productive, and therefore not necessarily commended. But what it also, that's my last point, would mean, given that we have a very, very broad audience, I think we would be very happy to also understand and identify the differences in perception that exist about those building blocks, because I am convinced that what was meant to be a starting point for our discussion may deserve some flexibility and making changes gradually to what is what we call shared understanding of building blocks for trust in philanthropy.
Thank you. Thank you. Any final remarks? We have come to the end of our time. Any final remarks from Annegret and Sarah? Would you like to add to this? That doesn't look to be the case. Or Sarah, you're sort of.
So I just at risk of repeating myself, I do think that the comments that have been made about the shared learning are really important and shouldn't be lost. I think that method of how is at least as important as the what within the dimensions of the model.
Thank you. Annegret, any final word?
Well, I think with this kind of peer learning, it's actually we're at the center of the topic about trust. So I think it's an interesting way to be followed.
Okay, so thank you very much indeed. We showed you some email addresses, so any one of you who would like to be in touch with us over this, please just get in touch with anyone and let us have your thoughts, or just come and say that you'd like to remain informed, anything you'd like to tell us. From our side, of course, we will take the lesson of the points that have been made and include them in the whole structure of the project. And thank you all very, very much for your comments, because they were really, really helpful. If you would like to take an active role, as I said, please come and join us. We are in the process of preparing a manual for users, for foundations who want to actually employ this whole methodology, this whole assessment tool in their own foundation. This will take another few months because we have to incorporate what we've been discussing here, but it will be out probably by the end of the summer. So then you can just take it and make use of it and let us know of your experiences. And we'll certainly be in touch with all of you again and try and keep you involved. If you have anything to add, please let us know. So with that, thank you all very, very much. Thanks, special thanks to our two panelists, Annegret and Sarah. Thanks to Rolf and Timo, who've been doing all the work on this project. And thanks to you all for joining us from really all over the world. And I hope we will be in touch. Thank you and stay well.